good afternoon to everyone. I have 12 o'clock straight up on my clock, so I think we will go ahead and get started. I'm so glad to see a lot of names popping up on the screen. Thank you for joining us for the inaugural session of our Policy Wise in Iowa series. I'm Ann Disher, and I'm the Executive Director of Common Good Iowa. I'm so happy to see you all on the line. I'm going to tell you a little bit about us and about this afternoon's agenda, and then we'll dive right into our topic, strengthening Iowa's workforce. So for those of you who are not familiar with us, first, I just want to tell you a little bit about Common Good Iowa. I tend to describe us as a new old organization. And of course, we're new because Common Good Iowa launched in 2020. And I know we've got folks on the line who were part of that virtual launch event we did just about 2 years ago. And then I say we're old because we were formed from the merger of the Child and Family Policy Center and the Iowa Policy Project. And those two organizations had a collective 50 years of experience in policy analysis, research, and advocacy. And that is the work that we still do today as Common Good Iowa. So we are a nonprofit organization and we are nonpartisan, although as you will see in this series, that does not mean we don't have a point of view. Our vision is a just, inclusive Iowa where public policies advance racial, gender, economic, and climate justice, and where the common good is supported by a fair, stable tax system. So that is where we are coming from when we talk to you about an array of policy issues facing our state today. Today, we're actually going to hear from one of our newer staff members who did not come from either the Child and Family Policy Center or Iowa Policy Project. Sean Finn is a policy analyst here at Common Good Iowa, and he will walk us through some of the key policy issues related to our workforce that face our state today. And then you will also hear from Mike Owen, our deputy director, who will facilitate a Q&A session at the end of Sean's presentation. Mike will be pulling questions from the chat, so feel free to drop questions you have there either during the presentation or once the Q&A gets started. Well, we are scheduled to close at 12:45, and we do want to honor everyone's time and try not to run over. So we'll just go ahead and get going. Sean, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you everybody for joining us today for this conversation about Iowa's workforce. So let's get into it. The unfortunate reality to start with is that Iowa's economy fails too many workers. Many full-time workers in the state can't make ends meet, even though they're working full-time, they're putting in the hard work, and yet, either they're getting paid minimum wage, or oftentimes they're being paid above minimum wage, and that is still not enough in today's economy. Earlier this year, Common Good Iowa launched our cost of living report, and in that we found that 1 in 7 Iowa households with at least one worker can't meet a basic needs budget. So really, our economy is not lifting up all of Iowa's families and all of Iowa's communities. So we know that a healthy economy is built on widespread prosperity, not prosperity for only the privileged few. We shouldn't judge our economy based on how rich the wealthiest of us get, but really we should judge it on how are we supporting every single Iowa family? And do all of our families and workers have the opportunities they need to support themselves and to make a good lives for themselves? The good news, after all of that bad news, the good news is that there are policies that work. And we know that they are out there. We know that they've worked in other instances. And so, and we can implement them in Iowa as long as we push for them and get them passed at the state level. So today's key priorities for the workforce that we'll be discussing are boosting wages, restoring our unemployment insurance system, fighting wage theft, and bolstering public sector bargaining. So let's start by diving into boosting wages. As you probably all are aware of, Iowa's minimum wage is still $7.25. It's been $7.25 since January of 2008, 14 years, and we have not seen an increase. In that time, of course, costs have gone up. It costs more to live, anywhere, including in Iowa. Although 30 states in the U.S. have raised their minimum wage above that federal floor of $7.25, including most of Iowa neighbors, $7.25 is still the minimum wage in Iowa. We know based on our cost of living report and, just from seeing everybody or seeing our neighbors, seeing our communities, that 725 is really not enough for anybody to get by in the state. And although a lot of businesses are starting to raise their wages above 725 for starting employees, there are still many employers in the state that pay minimum wage jobs, especially in rural Iowa. And oftentimes the workers who hold lower paying jobs, including minimum wage jobs, are disproportionately people of color and immigrants in our state. And so minimum wage, raising the minimum wage is not just an issue that affects our economy and lifts all boats, but it is a racial equity issue as well. We know that decades of discriminatory policies have caused some systemic issues that lead to this phenomenon of people of color holding lower wage jobs. And so we need to raise that minimum wage to ensure that we're raising all boats, making sure that everybody can get by. So the federal minimum wage, which is the same as Iowa's, is, according to this recent analysis by the Economic Policy Institute, is worth less than it was in 1956. This graph shows basically the buying power of the minimum wage throughout time. So if the current minimum wage of 725 can buy you today whatever 725 you can get for 725, you could buy more with that in 2009 when it first became the federal minimum wage. So as you look at this graph over time, you see how the minimum wage has given different buying powers. And you see a peak back in 1968 of when it was worth $12.12. So people making a minimum wage in 1968 would be like today if you were making a wage of $12.12. So we see that minimum wage, because it hasn't been raised in all this time, is really not keeping up with the increases in costs in our economy. So the federal minimum wage is worth 27% less than in 2009 and 40% less than in 1968. Back when it was in 2009, when it was last raised, it's as if you would be making about $10 today. So this really goes to show how much we've fallen behind in increasing the minimum wage. And why does the minimum wage matter? Well, it matters not only for the people who are working minimum wage jobs, but it matters more broadly in the economy as well. So take, for example, Hy-Vee. If a worker is hired on as a new cashier at Hy-Vee, they may be paid $7.25. That's what I was paid when I first started working at Hy-Vee back in high school. And Hy-Vee will pay, that minimum wage, and then they may have someone, for example, like a shift manager who is making, let's say, for example, $10 an hour. If the minimum wage was raised to $10 an hour, technically they wouldn't be legally required to increase the wage of that shift manager, but because there's a hierarchy and a pay scale that they use for their setting their wages, Hy-Vee will not only have to hire on new cashiers at $10 an hour, but they will raise the pay scale for those other lower wage employees to adjust the overall pay scales. So increasing the minimum wage doesn't just affect those people who would now be below the new minimum. It really helps lift up that whole lower end of the wage scale, and really helps people afford the cost of living in the state. We also know that among the lowest paid workers in the state are direct care workers. Think of childcare workers, nurses, and other of those who provide direct care. In 2019, the median household income in Iowa was about $62,000. And in that same year, the average annual wage for healthcare and social assistance employees was just $45,000, significantly below the median income. If you look at it in terms of average weekly wage for a couple of specific occupations, for nurses in our state, the average weekly wage is $675. And that's about $35,000 a year. And for social assistance workers, which includes childcare workers, the average weekly wage is $489. And that equates to about $25,000 per year. We know that that is just not enough for people to sustain a basic needs budget in our state, especially if you're raising kids and you have a family, and you may need to pay for something like childcare yourself. So what should we do about it? Overall, our recommendations for boosting wages are first to set a $15 minimum wage. Then we need the minimum wage to be indexed to the median wage in our state so that it automatically is adjusting as our economy grows. As we see over time, naturally our economy will increase and we'll have costs that go up, wages will go up, and the minimum wage should automatically be adjusting with it. So first off, increase that minimum wage. Then we also need to restore the authority of local governments to increase the minimum wage in their local area above the floor minimum. We know from our cost of living report, and again, from just our experience as Iowans, that the cost of living varies widely. You know, if you're living in rural Iowa, your cost of living is much more likely to be lower, especially in terms of things like housing, than if you were living in Des Moines, for example. So if local governments can set their minimum wage above the state floor, that can really more accurately reflect a living wage and what it costs to live in that area. We also need to eliminate the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers. So the current minimum wage for tipped workers in Iowa is $4.35, far below the $7.25. And although it is the law for tipped workers to get up to the base wages plus tips should equal $7.25 for the week on average, oftentimes tipped workers don't know that that's the law. They don't find out whether they're, being adequately paid. And employers often don't actually follow through on that. So we need to just completely eliminate that sub-minimum wage for tipped workers and just let the minimum wage be the minimum wage. And finally, to address the issue of low wages for direct care workers, we need to increase reimbursement rates from the state to programs like Medicare and child care assistance. So part of the reason that direct care workers have like Medicare and child care assistance sets these rates that they pay to providers. Because these reimbursement rates are so low and don't reflect market rates, then providers are bringing in less money from through these programs and can't afford to pay their workers living wages. So the state needs to increase their reimbursement rates for those types of programs. Next, let's dive into unemployment insurance. If you aren't aware, unemployment insurance is an earned benefit. That means that you have to meet certain criteria as an employee to qualify for unemployment insurance if you lose your job through no fault of your own. And the way that unemployment insurance is paid for is through contributions through the employee. So think of it kind of like when you see on your paycheck, on your pay stub, that you have an employer and an employee contribution for things like Social Security, Medicare, and unemployment insurance is like that, except it's just on the employer side. And so they have to consider that when they set your wage, and it's not reflected on your pay stub. So unemployment insurance is paid for by the employer, and the employee then qualifies for it after they meet certain criteria. And this is a table that is maybe a little tricky to understand that shows the contribution rates for employers in the state. Currently, the governor just announced that the contribution rates are going to be the lowest they've been in decades for Iowa. And we're not surprised about that because they set it up so that that would happen. But the current per employee cost for the median middle employer in the state is just $174 per employee per year. So really cuts to those rates really mostly affect employers that have the most number of employees. So those cuts that happened earlier this year by the legislature reduced the number of weeks available to unemployed Iowans in terms of the benefits they can receive. So if you lose your job through no fault of your own, you can qualify for previously up to 26 weeks of benefits. The legislature reduced that from 26 to 16, and they're expected to pay out $70 million less per year to unemployed Iowans as a result of that. And as a result of those cuts, the governor was able to announce that that tax rate for businesses would go down. But if you look at it, the average employer tax rate is just 1.19% as of 2021. It's going to go down very slightly as a result of this. And almost half of employers in the state don't pay anything in unemployment insurance tax. So really, who is going to benefit from these cuts? Not the workers, not the small businesses, but the businesses that lay off people frequently and have a lot of employees. The other meaningful result of the cut that the legislature made earlier this year was that they deflated wages. So when you lose your job through no fault of your own, and you go onto unemployment insurance, you start receiving benefits, you have to continue to seek work. And there are certain criteria that you have to meet about whether or not you can reject a job offer in those circumstances. So say, for example, you lose your job, and under the previous system, 4 weeks later, you're offered a job that is pays $5 an hour less than your previous job. So say you were making 25, they offer you a job that's $20 an hour. You could say, you know what, I need to hold out for a better job. 20 is just not going to cut it for being able to pay for my family's expenses. So I'm going to look for a better job, and I'm going to continue to receive benefits. Under these new changes, after just 1 week of being unemployed, you have to start accepting lower paying jobs. And a month after you're losing your job, you'd have to accept that $20 an hour job, even though you know that it won't cover your expenses as a parent or as provider for your family. Either you go ahead and you accept that $20 per hour job, or you lose your unemployment insurance benefits. So the effect that has is it deflates wages throughout the state. So instead of unemployed workers going out, seeking new jobs, getting good paying jobs, maybe even finding a more competitive job, instead, workers that are unemployed have to go and find lower paying jobs, and that deflates wages throughout the entire state, which is bad for the economy. So lawmakers need to restore the unemployment benefits back from 16 weeks to 26 weeks. 26 weeks, the majority of states have 26 weeks of unemployment insurance benefits. It's the national standard. So at the very least, it should be restored back to 26 weeks. They also need to expand eligibility for unemployment insurance. There are a lot of specific criteria around who can qualify for unemployment insurance, and a group of employees who don't qualify are those who are recently employed or people who are misclassified. So oftentimes they were called, their employer was calling them independent contractors instead of regular employees. And they do that so that they can avoid paying things like unemployment insurance tax and workers' compensation. And so these workers who are misclassified, they should also become eligible for unemployment insurance. And finally, lawmakers need to increase the taxable wage base for insurance. What is taxable wage base? Well, basically, so all these employers, when they pay unemployment insurance contribution tax, they pay it just on the first approximately $35,000 of their employee's salary. So if it's less than 35, they pay, whatever, 1.19% of that, or if up to 30, or if it's more than $35,000, they only pay 1.19% of that first $35,000. That's fixed in the law right now. And this needs to increase, and it needs to be indexed as well to the median wage so that as costs rise, as wages rise, our unemployment insurance stays afloat, can continue to sustain Iowans as they fluctuate in the workforce. So now, next, let's talk about wage theft. We have a report coming out next month that will dive deeply into the issue of wage theft in Iowa. We'll talk a little bit about this now because we think of it as a major issue for workers in our state. So we now know that employers are stealing wages from approximately 1 in 7 Iowa workers each year. That amounts to over $900 million each year in stolen wages. More than half of that is expected to be overtime violations, not paying people the appropriate wages for overtime, which is often 1.5 times their normal hourly rate, and minimum wage violations. There are also other violations that are part of this overall wage theft estimate, including things like illegal deductions from paychecks. So there are a variety of ways that employers steal these wages from workers, and we need to, as a state, step up to combat this issue of wage theft. We know that wage theft is costing Iowans 10 times more than all other types of theft in the state combined. So if you look at things like robbery, burglary, larceny, you add those all up, they cost Iowans about $90 million per year. And along the x-axis here, these should be millions, not thousands. So about $90 million per year in burglary, larceny, etc. And about a third of that is recovered by law enforcement agencies. But each year, 10 times that, over $900 million is stolen through wage theft. And just 0.2% of that total amount stolen is recovered by law enforcement agencies or by government agencies. So here's a bit more about the picture of wage theft in Iowa. For every $1,000 stolen through wage theft from workers, the government recovers just $2. Iowa Workforce Development, which is the only state agency that is responsible for addressing wage payment claims, has just 2 investigators to cover claims for 1.4 million workers in our state. And the federal agency in charge of addressing wage payment violations is the Department of Labor. And we know that they're currently understaffed and severely backlogged. On average, it takes over 2 years for a case to get through the Department of Labor. And so these 2 agencies that are responsible for standing up for Iowa workers or workers throughout the country are really unable and underfunded to do their job to combat wage theft. So lawmakers need to hire more investigators at the state and federal level, and they also need to educate workers. Workers need to know their wage payment rights in our state. They need to know the minimum wage. They need to know overtime law, and they need to know what it is legal and illegal for employers to deduct from their paychecks. They need to know about how they should be classified. So there are a variety of issues that workers need to be educated about in order to be able to stand up for their rights and to file those kinds of claims for wage payment violations. We also need to increase penalties for offending businesses. The most common scenario by far in the state is that if a worker or if an employer gets caught doing one of these wage theft practices, stealing something from, stealing wages via minimum wage or overtime violations, is that if they're caught, they just have to pay it. They're like, it's a slap on the wrist. They say, don't do that, pay them what they were owed, and that's it. So we need to require fines and increase the penalties for employers, especially ones that are repeat violators of these wage payment laws. We also need to remove state preemptions regarding wage theft. So there are lots of local policy options, such as fair scheduling and pay laws that many localities throughout the country have implemented and have been proven to help reduce instances of wage theft. And the state of Iowa disallows local governments from using those policies. That's called preemption. And so we need to remove those state preemptions so that local authorities can fight back against wage theft, especially because the state isn't doing nearly enough to fight it themselves. So finally, let's talk about public sector bargaining. In 2017, the legislature cut down a lot of the topics that public sector unions can negotiate. First off, they separated two types of classifications for public sector unions: public safety and non-public safety. And they, for the non-public safety, which represents thousands upon thousands of Iowa workers, they disallowed them, barred them from negotiating topics like health insurance, leaves of absence, supplemental pay, transfers and evaluations, all a bunch of issues that are really important for workers to feel like their job is supporting them, to find the job to be worthwhile. Oftentimes, public sector, you kind of expect to earn less than you would if you were in the private sector, but oftentimes you would go for it because of your love for public service or because they have good benefits. And a lot of these benefits are no longer negotiable for public sector workers, which is a real issue for sustaining our workforce, our public workforce in the state. Also, it's an issue of rights. Workers, we need to support workers' rights, and public sector bargaining rights should really set an example for the private sector bargaining rights in our state. Unfortunately, in Iowa, the number of workers who are represented by a union has been cut in about half over the past 20 years, which is really terrible because we know that workers who are represented by unions have higher wages. They are less likely to experience wage theft. They're more likely to have good benefits, including health insurance. There are many reasons why workers who are represented by unions are stronger workers, are healthier workers, and they support healthier communities and neighborhoods. So as we cut away at union rights, at collective bargaining rights in our state, we make things worse for workers in our state, and we make things worse for our economy overall. So we need our state lawmakers to restore the collective bargaining rights for public sector employees and to protect worker rights altogether moving forward. This can encompass a wide array of issue areas and topics. And so this is a broad statement, restoring collective bargaining rights, protecting worker rights, and it includes a lot of different policies that we need to promote. But overall, all of those policies need to go back to protecting worker rights and lifting up workers, especially from the bottom in terms of low-wage workers in our state. Because like we said at the very beginning, prosperity for all, including at the lowest end, is how we judge a healthy economy. So if you have any questions or comments regarding any of these policies or anything included in this presentation today, please feel free to get in touch with me. Here's my contact information, or come to our website. We have information available there as well. And before I turn it over to Mike, I wanted to talk to you all a little bit about how you can support Common Good Iowa's work. So we all want a just society where Iowans can support and provide for their families. And as I've shown today, Iowa's economy fails too many workers. We need to work together to fight wage theft, strengthen our unemployment system, and increase the minimum wage to allow families the chance to support themselves and break out of poverty. So we need $10,000 for our legislative action initiative to hold the line for workers and go to the next legislative session and fight for workers. So please consider donating an amount that feels meaningful to you and support our fight. Here are a few examples of donation amounts that could go towards a specific purpose, such as $66 for mailing a postcard to every single legislator, or $500 if you're feeling generous and able to launch a targeted issue campaign. So feel free to go to our website there at commongoodiowa.org/donate and make a donation. And before we launch into the Q&A, I'm going to turn it over to Mike to talk about our upcoming webinars in the series and to moderate our Q&A session.
Well, thank you very much, Sean. I covered a lot of ground in that presentation and appreciate that. I hope people gained a lot from it. We did get a few questions in the chat, but I first wanted to point out materials that are going to be available on the website, which as you can see on the screen, where that's available. And right now it's very prominent right on the front page on how you can link to that page. But you can get a 2-page summary of the issues that Sean just covered in today's session. And you can also get a list of the coming attractions, shall we say. Our next one will be next Wednesday, again at noon, on solutions for childcare. And so that will be our next topic out of our 6-part series here in advance of the election. So to start off the questions, I wanted to bring up a couple things that people sent both in the Q&A and in the chat. And the first one really addresses a question I had about, asking yourself about how many of these issues that we discussed today are things you're hearing about during the campaign, and are they things you want to be hearing about during the campaign? If you're not hearing about them, are you interested in talking to candidates about them? Are you interested in talking to people who are elected after the election about them? But are these things being raised? Sean, what are you hearing about that at this point?
Sorry, Mike, could you restate that question?
Well, are you getting an impression that these are issues that are getting enough attention right now?
Oh, right. I really don't think that these are issues that are getting enough attention. I think that there are some important issues, of course, being discussed in our state right now, particularly around education, schools, and abortion access. And I think those are very important issues. But we just saw some really terrible cuts to our income tax last session and to unemployment insurance. And while we aren't necessarily feeling the pain of those cuts at this present moment, we will be feeling the pain of those cuts in the very near future. So I think that the issues of wages, especially direct care worker wages and the minimum wage, are really important to be talking to our lawmakers about. We need to make that a political reality, and the way we do that is by continuing to talk about it and putting pressure on legislators. And we really need to be talking about restoring our unemployment insurance system. That's really, really critical for continuing to lift up workers throughout the state. If we don't have that momentum to sustain workers through unemployment insurance, we really start faltering at the core of our economy, at the core of our workforce. And then finally, we need to keep putting pressure on workers on legislators in terms of wage theft. That has lost a lot of attention in the public over the last 10 years. It's hurting so many workers, and so many workers don't even know that they're being hurt by it. So legislators really need to stand up, tell workers, these are your rights. We need to defend your rights and start coming up with solutions.
I'm gonna jump in here because I think, essentially, I think at the heart of that question is around sort of political viability of some of the things that we've talked about today. And it's clear on unemployment insurance, we lost the battle last session. We opposed those cuts. We and our labor friends and other folks opposed those cuts because we knew they were bad. And so I think, if you keep doing the same thing, you're going to keep getting the same results. I think that we will keep talking about that issue because ultimately we need a different, different facts, different stories, different deciders to revisit that. So I think actually there's, parts of this agenda that we talked to you about today that are probably more politically doable. What we gave you today was a preview of that wage theft report. The research is done. We're putting final touches on the report itself, and I think some of those figures we shared with you all are pretty jaw dropping, to be honest. And I think we feel like that there is a real impetus and that there's a real place to have conversations with folks, candidates, and soon to be elected officials around that issue. That feels like one where we feel like there really could be some room to move. I think some of the things we talked to you about, we understand. I mean, the minimum wage has been at $7.25 an hour since, 2008, 2009. Mm-hmm. Obviously, it's a tough political issue. But, we have decided we're going to talk about these things, even if they're politically more difficult, and we acknowledge some of them are.
And that's, one of the questions that has followed during this was someone who's curious about what we know about public support for these positions. I know that historically Iowans have supported raising the minimum wage. This hasn't even been a close question.
Yeah.
So it's really a question as to how much it's going to be pushed. I mean, our role in it is a combination of certainly of advocating for it, but showing people the impact of raising the minimum wage. As Sean mentioned in the presentation, it isn't just people making at the minimum wage who benefit from this. It's people who are making between the current minimum wage and what the new minimum wage would be, and actually a little bit above that. And it's well over 400,000 workers in this state that would benefit from an increase in the minimum wage to $15. So it's not an insignificant issue in a population of about 3 million people, when you're going to see well over 400,000 people benefiting from the increase and their families. It was pointed out by our friend Charlie Bruner that this is that wages alone aren't the answer. That there are half of all people in Iowa are in families with children. They need more income, and that wages aren't the only thing. That things like a child tax credit can be expanded to better take into account the cost of raising families. And he also pointed out that there are some workers that are exempt from the current minimum wage. So it's all part of the mix, I think. But I think it's also fair to point out that it's kind of hard to expect that you're going to address all these many things if you're not going to do some of the low-hanging fruit, which, again, politically, increasing the minimum wage is a political winner for legislators if they chose to take that approach. Another question we have is how will the upcoming wage theft report be promoted and or used to inform the public and legislators? Sean, would you like to talk about that?
Sure. We will absolutely be talking to the media about the report, hoping to spread the word through newspapers throughout Iowa and local media. We will, of course, be having it out on our website and blasting it out to email subscribers. There will be the report itself, and we'll also provide a shorter fact sheet version that is easy to read and easy to visualize all these numbers that come at you in the report, so that we can share them on social media and share them to legislators and local leaders as well.
And I'm going to jump in and just give a shout out to our friends at the Center for Workers' Justice of Eastern Iowa and Iowa City and the University of Iowa Labor Center, who are good partners on this particular project and will be helping us really find ways to promote it and helping in some cases bringing the stories that we think can really bring the numbers to light. So shout out to our partners and to our friends at EPI. I know I think we have a couple of people from the Economic Policy Institute on the line too, who have been really good thinkers around how you talk about these issues and move the needle on them.
Good. We have a question here asking whether the Federal Department of Labor makes any recommendations on what the ratio should be for states on investigating employer issues such as wage theft enforcement.
I am not aware of a Department of Labor recommendation. However, there is a recommendation from the United Nations International Labor Organization that there be one labor investigator, including wage theft, for every 10,000 workers. So considering we have just 2 at the moment, I think that comes out to needing, at least 100 more, right? Yeah, we're very, very far behind that recommendation. And we're behind our neighboring states as well, for what it's worth. Even if we hired the 2 open positions that there currently are for wage investigators in our state, we would be very, very far behind. And our neighboring states, even some of our more populated, neighboring states, have significantly higher number of investigators and handle many more wage violation cases. So we definitely need to step up in that area.
It's definitely been a frustration for years of people trying to get some attention, serious attention from the state on enforcing the laws regarding pay for workers. And so it's an important issue that you're raising, and we're looking forward to getting more out about it in the next month or so. Before I turn it back over to Sean to close up, I wanted to remind you that the materials from this presentation will be on the website. The 2-pager that summarizes this issue is already up there, and we'll also have the slides and the recording available. The other point I wanted to make is that if you have other questions for us, please follow up with those, and we can get back to you later. We wanted to be able to keep these sessions short to make it more possible for people to participate, but stay in touch with us. We're interested to hear what you have to say. And on that note, I will turn it back over to Sean to close up the session.
All right. Thanks, Mike. And thank you all for those questions and that engagement. It's really great to hear what you all have to say. I just wanted to leave you with a final closing thought as leave the presentation today. And I wanted to share this quote from this labor leader, Cesar Chavez, very influential labor leader in his time. He said, "We cannot seek achievement for ourselves and forget about progress and prosperity for our community. Our ambitions must be broad enough to include the aspirations and needs of others for their sakes and for our own." So with that, I hope you all have a wonderful Wednesday afternoon, and looking forward to seeing you at our future series.